She'd always kept that account separate. A small savings fund, tucked away in a credit union she chose for its quiet reliability. It wasn't much, not compared to what some people had, but it was hers, scraped together one lunch packed from home at a time, one Friday night spent inside instead of out, one overtime shift she didn't want but took anyway because she told herself, one day you'll be glad you did. That day had come. When the diagnosis landed like a punch to her ribs, the words surgery and hospital stay delivered so clinically by a doctor who'd seen this all before, she'd felt her heart drop, but at least she'd told herself she was ready. Ready in the only way she could be, she had the money. No panic about bills or insurance haggling or deciding which prescription to skip this month. She'd done everything right. Lying in that narrow hospital bed, she'd felt that little cushion of certainty hold her up through the worst of it. The procedures, the endless poking and prodding, the way her body felt like it didn't quite belong to her anymore, it was all so much, but at least she knew when she got out, she wouldn't be buried under debt. It was the only thing that let her sleep at night. So when the discharge papers came, and the nurse handed her the stack of follow-up bills and pharmacy receipts, she didn't flinch. She waited until she was home, propped up on her couch with a glass of stale ginger ale and her laptop balanced on her knees, before she logged into her account. She typed her password twice, hands shaking from the residual pain meds. For a moment she thought she'd entered it wrong. The numbers blinked back at her, $47.36. She stared at the screen so long her vision blurred, her pulse drumming in her ears like she'd been thrown back under anesthesia. $47.36. Where there should have been enough for her follow-up treatments, her medications, the rent she budgeted so carefully while she was off work. Gone. She checked the statement line by line, heart sinking with each withdrawal. The biggest one was flagged, a payment to an event management company she didn't recognize. Thousands, gone in a single click. Her phone buzzed on the armrest beside her. She picked it up, her breath shallow, and saw a text from her mother, "We need to talk, come for dinner when you're feeling up to it." She didn't respond. She didn't have the strength for their excuses yet. Instead, she called the bank, voice trembling as she verified her information, hoping there'd been some error, a glitch, anything. But the customer service rep was polite and apologetic. The transfer was authorized by her mother, who she'd trusted with temporary access while she was under anesthesia, just in case the hospital needed anything paid urgently. She sat frozen on her couch, the hospital bracelet still wrapped around her wrist like a cruel reminder. She pictured her mother's tight smile, the way she always said, "Family comes first." And her sister, beautiful, bright-eyed, always chasing the next big moment. The same sister who'd been gushing about her dream venue for months but complained they couldn't afford the full deposit. She'd laughed it off back then, said they'd find a way. She guessed they had. The betrayal felt bigger than the empty account. Bigger than the debt she'd now face alone. It was the casual ease of it, the way they dipped into her lifeline like it was spare change for a new dress. The way her mother's text made it clear they didn't see a problem worth apologizing for. The way she knew, deep down, that if she didn't stand up now, they'd do it again. She closed the laptop, the screen still glowing the word balance, $47.36. She pressed the hospital bracelet into her palm until the plastic edge dug into her skin. She'd get up. She'd go to that family dinner. She'd hear them out, because she needed to hear them say it to her face. But she already knew one thing for certain, they'd stolen from the wrong woman this time. She knew the moment she stepped through her mother's front door that they'd rehearsed it. The way they sat around the dining table, the table she'd eaten birthday cakes at, the table she'd done her homework at, the table where they'd all pretended to be one big loyal family, it felt like a cheap stage set now. Her mother and sister and her brother-in-law-to-be all squeezed together like they were bracing for impact. The house smelled like roast chicken and rosemary, a smell she'd once found comforting. Now it made her stomach turn. Her mother called out, "Too bright, too brittle, there you are. Sit down, you look so tired. You should eat something, sweetheart." She dropped her bag by the door and stayed standing. She didn't bother to sit. She was tired, but it wasn't her body that was worn thin this time, it was every piece of trust she'd once thought would hold her up when the world got too hard. Her sister was the first to break the silence. She was always the performer, big eyes glistening, hands clasped under her chin like a child waiting for forgiveness she thought she deserved by default. "I know you're upset," she started, her voice soft, syrupy. "We didn't want you to find out like that. But it was just, we were stuck. The deposit deadline was coming up, and Mom said..." Her mother shot her a look, but it was too late. "Mom said..." The words stuck in her mind like a splinter. She turned to her mother, who met her stare head-on, chin tilted up like she was the one who'd been wronged. "It's not as bad as you think. It was just a portion. You know you'll be back at work soon, and your sister needed this. It was an emergency." Her laugh came out too sharp. "An emergency? My surgery was an emergency. Keeping the lights on while I can't work is an emergency. Your dream wedding is not." Her sister's eyes filled with tears, they always did when things got uncomfortable. "Please don't make this ugly. We were going to pay you back. You know I wouldn't just steal from you." She raised an eyebrow. "No? What would you call it then?" No one answered. Her mother fiddled with her napkin, mouth pressed into a thin line. The fiancé stared at the floor like he wished he were anywhere else. She felt the heat rise in her chest, not the shame they'd taught her to feel any time she stood up for herself, but the kind that cracked through years of forced silence. "You didn't even ask me." She said it more to herself than to them. "You didn't think for one second that maybe I'd say no. You just decided my health was less important than your party." Her mother's eyes snapped up, sharp and cold now. The mask slipped just enough for the truth to show. "Family sacrifices for family. You'll get the money back eventually. But your sister only gets one wedding. Would you rather she cancel everything? Embarrass herself? You want people to think we're cheap? What's a few months of you tightening your belt compared to her happiness?" She almost laughed again. This was the part that stung the most, that they didn't even see how cruel it was. That they expected her to swallow this, thank them for keeping it in the family, and move on like a dutiful extra in the story of her sister's big day. Her sister sniffled, voice trembling now as she played her favorite role. "Please, I'll pay you back after the honeymoon. We just needed the venue deposit. It's non-refundable, there's nothing we can do now." She stood there in the doorway, her palms pressed flat against her thighs, trying to ground herself. She looked at the cheap fairy lights already strung up around the mantel, the wedding favors stacked in boxes in the corner. It wasn't just the money they'd stolen. It was the way they did it with such calm certainty, so sure she'd never fight back. She felt the words gather in her mouth, clear and heavy like a stone. "Enjoy your dinner. And your wedding." She turned to leave, her mother's protests following her down the hall, but she didn't stop. She knew they thought she was bluffing, that she'd let it go, like always. But as she shut the door behind her, she felt it in her bones. This time, they'd learn what it cost to take her for granted. She woke up the next morning in her tiny apartment with the taste of that dinner still clinging to her tongue, bitter, sharp, something she knew would linger far longer than she'd let on. Her phone was already buzzing on the nightstand. Missed calls from her mother. A string of messages from her sister, each one more syrupy than the last. "I'm so sorry you're mad. You know we didn't mean it like that. I'm family. Family makes sacrifices." She turned the phone over, screen down, and pressed her face into her pillow until the muffled sunlight was just a haze behind her eyelids. She wanted to sink into that darkness, to drift somewhere where her mind didn't replay every word at that kitchen table like a cruel movie she never asked to watch. But the pain in her side wouldn't let her. Her stitches were still fresh, her body still fragile. Every time she shifted, a sharp ache radiated through her ribs, a reminder that she hadn't just lost money, she'd lost her sense of safety. That account had been her cushion, her net. It was the thing that let her close her eyes in that hospital bed and believe, for just a second, that she could breathe without drowning. She sat up slowly, her hand pressed to the gauze beneath her shirt, and forced herself to stand. She moved through the apartment on autopilot, kettle on, tea bag waiting in a chipped mug, the same routine she'd built for herself before any of this happened. Back then she'd thought routine would protect her. That if she planned carefully, saved enough, kept her head down and didn't ask for too much, she'd be okay. Safe. She carried her tea to the couch, lowered herself carefully onto the cushion that sagged in the middle. The medical bills were stacked on her coffee table, each envelope a small, white threat. She'd kept them sealed for days, telling herself she'd face them when she was stronger. Now, with her savings emptied for a wedding she wasn't even invited to, there was nothing left to soften the blow. She tore the first envelope open with hands that trembled more from anger than fear. The numbers blurred together: fee co-pays, medication, follow-ups she couldn't afford to skip. Each total felt like a brick on her chest, pressing down until her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She remembered all the things she'd given up to build that fund. The vacations she turned down, the shoes she wore until the soles split open, the nights she'd stayed in while her sister bragged about bottomless brunches and fancy hair appointments. She'd done it without bitterness, telling herself this was what responsible people did. You sacrificed little pleasures to be ready for the big storms. And when the storm finally came, her family had robbed her of her umbrella. She laughed, one short, humorless sound that startled her in the quiet of her living room. She imagined her sister, radiant in her white dress, posing for engagement photos paid for with the money she'd scraped together by saying no to herself over and over again. She pictured the look on her mother's face, so certain that she'd cave, that she'd nod and smile and tell everyone it was fine because family is everything. She could feel that old guilt trying to worm its way back in, whispering that maybe she was cruel for wanting her money back. That maybe she was selfish for wanting her own survival to matter as much as her sister's big day. But then she looked at the stack of unpaid bills and knew, in her bones, that no one was going to fight for her if she didn't do it herself. She picked up her phone again, ignoring the messages that kept popping up. She searched for the wedding venue's name, the fancy one her sister had bragged about endlessly before they'd found a way to pay the deposit. She didn't know what she'd say yet, or how far she'd go. But she knew one thing as surely as she knew the ache in her side: they'd stolen her safety. They wouldn't get her silence, too. She spent the rest of that week drifting between the couch and her bed, her body healing inch by inch while her mind spun in relentless circles. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured the kitchen table, the excuses, the way her mother's lips pressed together like her disappointment was something she had caused, like she'd made a scene over nothing. She'd always believed you had to bleed for family. That was the story she'd grown up with, whispered at holiday dinners, mumbled when her sister messed up again and needed just a little help. And she'd told herself she was strong for putting everyone else first. But now, staring at the stack of medical bills and the empty account that used to hold her future, she wondered if maybe she'd just been easy. Convenient. The dependable one they could always squeeze dry. On Thursday, her friend Carla stopped by with a bag of groceries, the first real kindness she'd felt in days. They sat cross-legged on the couch with paper cups of takeout soup balanced between them, the TV droning on in the background while Carla rattled off her latest work gossip. It almost felt normal, until Carla mentioned it. Did you know they booked that fancy place outside town? The one with the big garden and the old farmhouse? I didn't even think your sister could afford that. The spoon paused halfway to her lips. I know, she said quietly. She couldn't. Carla went on, oblivious. I drove past it last week. The sign was up for a private event. It's so gorgeous. They're lucky it was still open, they're impossible to get into this close to summer. She nodded, her mind somewhere else entirely. Carla kept talking, but her words faded under the steady thrum of realization that filled her chest like a drumbeat. She could see it all so clearly, her sister twirling through that flower garden, smug as ever, her mother bragging to distant relatives about how we made it happen. A party, all glitter and sparkle, paid for with the money she'd spent years scraping together to save her own life. The unfairness of it burned through her like acid, but underneath that burn, she felt something shift. For once, she didn't want to push it down. She didn't want to be the bigger person, the understanding daughter who smiled politely while they gutted her future. When Carla left, she pulled her laptop back onto her knees, her stitches still tight under her thin t-shirt. She stared at the venue's glossy website, the sprawling lawns, the tastefully restored farmhouse, the promises of an unforgettable day in gold lettering. She wondered if her sister had felt a single moment of shame as she signed the contract with money she hadn't earned. She found the contact page, the owner's email listed right under a cheerful photo of him with his wife. She read it twice, then reached for her phone. For a moment, she hesitated. She could already hear her mother's voice in her head, "You'd ruin your sister's wedding over a few $1,000s?" But that money wasn't just dollars. It was her right to heal without begging. Her right to not have her future yanked away to fund someone else's perfect day. She tapped the screen and dialed the number, her heart pounding in her ears as it rang. She almost hoped it would go to voicemail so she could chicken out, but then a warm, polite voice answered on the third ring. "Hello, Whitewood Estate Events, this is David speaking." She cleared her throat, her fingers trembling where they pressed into her thigh. "Hi, David. I think you should hear something about one of your bookings." She felt the words lining up behind her teeth, the truth that had been gnawing at her for days, finally ready to come out. She didn't know exactly what he'd say, or how it would end. But she knew one thing, they'd stolen her safety once. They wouldn't throw their party with the proceeds. And she'd make damn sure of it. When she hung up the phone, her hand was still shaking. Not from fear, not exactly. It was more like the rush you feel when you've stepped off a cliff and you're still waiting to see if you'll fly or crash. She'd thought for sure she'd stumble over her words, but the truth poured out of her so easily once she started, the stolen money, the savings meant for surgery, the cold way they'd spun it as a family favor she should be grateful for. She'd laid it all bare for a stranger whose voice grew more and more strained the longer she talked. David, the venue owner, didn't interrupt her. He didn't push her off the line or tell her it wasn't his problem. When she finished, she half expected him to say he couldn't help, that business was business, a non-refundable deposit was just that. But instead he was quiet for a moment, like he was trying to put the pieces together in his head. "I don't want to overstep," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, "but I'm not comfortable hosting an event paid for with money like that. I'd need to verify things, of course, but if what you're telling me is true, I'd rather lose the booking than be part of that." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in days, the knot in her chest loosened. "I can show you everything," she told him. "The account statements. The messages. I'm not making this up." He promised he'd follow up, that he'd speak with the couple directly, and she could tell from his voice that he meant every word. They hung up with polite goodbyes, a word that felt so small for what she'd just done. She spent the next few days in a haze of phone calls and emails. David asked for copies of her bank statements, and she sent them, her hand steady as she hit send on every detail of her private pain. She didn't care anymore about keeping the family's secrets. They hadn't cared about keeping hers. On Friday night, the call came. She was curled up on the couch with a heating pad pressed to her side, a dull ache pulsing under her stitches, when her phone rang again. It was David. He didn't waste time. "It's done," he said. "I spoke with them. They admitted the money wasn't theirs to spend. I told them I won't host the wedding. They asked about a refund, but the deposit was non-refundable, and I won't make an exception for fraud. They're furious. I thought you should know." She pictured her sister's face, her mother's look of horror when they realized their perfect day was slipping through their fingers because the person they'd wronged refused to stay quiet for once. She imagined the frantic phone calls, the last-minute pleas. She wondered what excuses they'd spin now, what story they'd craft to keep themselves the heroes in their own heads. But she didn't feel sorry. Not anymore. She thanked David, her voice calm but stronger than it had sounded in weeks. She'd spent her whole life being the fallback plan, the family ATM, the good daughter who swallowed her anger so no one else would have to. Now they could choke on the silence she left behind instead. Her phone exploded within the hour. A dozen missed calls from her mother, then her sister, each voicemail more desperate than the last. How could you do this? You embarrassed us. You ruined everything. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and let their words bounce off the four walls of her tiny living room. For the first time, those walls felt like a fortress instead of a prison. They'd called her selfish for wanting her own life to come first. They'd called her cruel for refusing to sacrifice her future so her sister could stand in a garden in a white dress pretending she'd paid her own way. Let them. If this was cruelty, she'd take it, because the only thing crueler would have been to let them keep getting away with it. She pressed her palm to her side, feeling the dull throb of healing. This pain, at least, was hers. And so was the quiet that settled over her as she let her phone buzz and buzz and buzz, unanswered. She didn't pick up when they called again the next morning. Not when her mother's number flashed on the screen in angry red, not when her sister's texts came in so fast they blurred into one endless vibration on her nightstand. She lay on her side, one hand pressed lightly to her stomach where the stitches still pulled tight if she moved too fast, and watched the phone light up and fade, light up and fade. Outside her window, the sun rose slow and soft over the rooftops. It painted her tiny apartment gold and dusty, revealing every scratch on the thrifted dresser, the half-unpacked boxes stacked like miniature barricades near the front door. For once, she didn't mind the mess. It felt honest, imperfect, unpolished, hers. She made herself get up, feet warm on the battered floorboards, kettle humming on the stovetop. She'd spent the last few years bending herself into a shape that would fit their plans, that would keep her mother calm, her sister grateful, the family reputation intact. And what had they given her in return? A gut full of shame, an empty bank account, and a lesson she was glad she'd finally learned. She poured tea into her favorite chipped mug, the one her sister once called cheap when she spotted it in her cabinet. Funny how that little judgment stuck in her head for so long. She sipped slowly, staring at her phone where it sat face down on the counter. Every ping, every buzz was a plea in the same tired language, come back into the fold. Be our fallback. Be quiet. But she'd done her time being quiet. She'd sat at family dinners listening to her mother praise her sister's big dreams while dismissing her practical ones. She'd stood in that sterile hospital hallway, white-knuckling her fear while her mother asked if she was sure this was necessary, so expensive, after all. She'd kept her head down when they dipped into her savings because it's just a loan, because she'll understand. And for a while, she had. She'd let them explain away every little betrayal. But she saw it now, how they counted on her shame to keep her from fighting back. How they mistook her softness for weakness. She sank into her couch, legs tucked under her, tea steaming against her palm. She thought about the wedding that wouldn't happen at that beautiful venue, how her sister would spin the story now, painting herself the victim, telling everyone how her bitter sister ruined her special day. Let her. Let them all. The truth was quiet, but it was hers. She'd protected it like a flame cupped in her hands through the darkest parts of her recovery. Now she didn't need to explain it to anyone. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed again. A final message from her mother. You've embarrassed this family. I hope you're happy. She almost laughed. Happy? Not yet. Her savings were gone. Her medical bills still sat like a weight on her coffee table. Her body was healing slower than she wanted. There was nothing easy about any of this. But there was a lightness inside her now, something stubborn and sharp she hadn't felt since she was a kid daring to dream she'd grow up and do things her way. She swiped her mother's message aside and opened a fresh note instead. A list of new savings goals, of freelance gigs she'd take on when she was strong enough, of friends she'd invite over to fill her empty apartment with the laughter her family never gave her freely. A plan that didn't require anyone's permission. She closed her eyes and pictured herself next year, or 5 years from now, strong enough to stand on her own, free enough to never again wonder if she was being selfish for surviving. She'd wear that word like a crown now: selfish. Self-protecting. Self-sufficient. Self-loved. She leaned her head back against the couch, the tea warm against her chest, her phone finally silent. For the first time in her life, she wasn't their backup plan. She was her own. And she wouldn't give that up for any party in the world.